Well, thank you very much. So how many of you have ever worked on a failed product? Oh, nobody. I guess everybody has, right? If you've been in the product business for any amount of time, you've worked on a failed product. In fact, the chances favor that, right? Well, I have a similar story. Back in my IBM days, this was the first product I worked on. 1984, new engineer in the space, worked on the PC Junior. You may be familiar with this product. IBM was entering the home computer business. We thought this was a grand slam. Unfortunately, the headline in the Wall Street Journal the day after we introduced the product read, "The PC Junior is a flop." And we thought, that's odd. Why would they say that? And we realized it was because it was a flop. It took us about a year to realize that it was a flop. And it got me thinking about, how did they know that? Like, how did they got the product that day? They put it through some rigor and said, wow, this thing's not very good. So I formed a hypothesis over the years that said, if we knew what metrics our customers were going to use to measure the success of our product, we could just design the product around that set of metrics and have a predictable innovation. In the case of the PC Junior, we had no idea what those metrics were, obviously, right? We were just building some other set of metrics, and we paid a dear price for that. So the thought was, is this possible? Well, it turns out that it is possible. 7 years later, we had our first success with the approach, helping a medical device company, Cordis Corporation, increase their market share from just 1% to over 20% by rebuilding their angioplasty balloon line. So we knew we were onto something, and I left IBM in 1991 to form Strategen. And since that time, we've released a lot of information on the approach. You can see that we've written articles, books, and so on that describe the concept. And I introduced ODI to Clay Christensen back in 1999. And he referred to it in his book, The Innovative Solution, in 2002, and called out the job to be done. Well, it turned out that nomenclature has really stuck. And today you'll hear the theory about this called jobs to be done theory. And the approach that we use to put it into practice is called outcome-driven innovation. So you'll hear me refer to that as well. Clay also goes on to say in his latest book that if you focus on the job, innovation can become predictable. And in his keynote at the front end of innovation earlier this year, he said it could be 100% predictable. Well, our approach isn't quite 100% predictable, but we've got a success rate that's about 86%, which is about 5 times the industry average. Now, that's a pretty dramatic claim, right? How do you innovate at a pace that's 5 times more effective than other companies? Well, this is what I want to show you, how it's done. So let me start by describing the way we think about innovation. After this PC Junior debacle, I worked on a product team inside IBM for about 5 years trying to figure this out. The very first thing we thought is, we need to talk about innovation as a process. And at a high level, it's a pretty simple process. We're trying to come up with solutions that address unmet needs, right? There's only 2 inputs here, solutions and needs. Shouldn't be that hard, but turns out that it's not that easy. There's a couple of ways in which you can go about the innovation process. One is first come up with lots of ideas and see which ones stick. That's called the ideas first approach. It has a new name called the fail fast. And the other approach is called the needs first approach, where we first stop to discover all the customer's needs, figure out which are unmet, discover segments of customers with different unmet needs, and then come up with solutions that address them. Now, this is marketing 101, right? This sounds like, of course you should do this way, right? It's the most efficient path, but it hasn't yielded much better results. And the reason is interesting. What we've seen over the years is that within companies, you could have your development team, your planners, and so on, all sitting in a room together, marketing, sales, and you all have the same motivation. You're trying to create products that better satisfy customer needs. But there's no agreement on what a need actually is. And in fact, each individual in the room has their own experiences and insights, and they don't agree on what a need is, what the needs are, or which are unmet. So in that situation, it's really hard to agree on what the right solution is. When we think about customer needs, I often see all these terms bandied about like they're all okay inputs. Now, they should all be effective. The pains, the gains, the anxieties, the latent needs, the requirements, solutions, as if any input will do into the process. And this is really part of the issue. And when we look at how it's been defined from a professional standpoint, there's a dozen or so VOC practitioners who all define a customer need in a different way. So this has been the ongoing issue that we've suffered with for years. So this is what we took on. We said, well, how do we have to define customer needs to make them a useful input into the innovation process? I like thinking about, again, innovation as it's an equation. We're trying to come up with solutions that address unmet needs. It's like we're setting up a model. We're going to test all these different solutions against some set of metrics, like in the PC Junior case, and we're going to figure out which solution is the one we should go pursue. Now, as in any good equation, there has to be a constant in the equation. Everything can't be a variable, right? And the innovation equation, certainly solutions are ever changing. That's the variable in the equation, which means that somehow we have to define a need as a constant in the equation. The input that we get from customers day one to go build the product has to be a valid input 2 years later when we release the product. And I know in the software space, some of that life cycle time is much shorter. And this is where jobs theory comes into play. When you look at Theodore Levitt's quote, he talks about the quarter-inch drill and the quarter-inch hole. What this does is it provides us a different lens. So instead of going to customers and asking them how to make a better drill, how about if we go to customers and ask them about the underlying process they're trying to execute? The underlying process is stable over time, which means we can break that process down into steps. We can figure out how people measure success along each step of the way. And those metrics are what we call the customer's desired outcomes. This is really the essence of what outcome-driven innovation is all about. These are the metrics people will use to judge the value of our product, because people buy products to get jobs done. And this is the reason why this theory was invented. The whole purpose of this is to look at this through a new lens, to focus on the job, not the customer, not the product. And the reason we're doing it is because the job is stable over time, allowing us to come up with a set of needs that is stable over time. Right? This allows us to set up this model. So when we think about innovation, we're going to look at this through this new lens. The first step in the ODI process is to define the market. And we're not going to define the market as a technology or a product. We're going to define a market as a group of people and the job they're trying to get done. When it comes to customer needs, they're not anything goes. It's going to be defined as the metrics people use to measure success when getting a job done. When we define unmet needs, we're not only going to look at what's unmet, we're going to look at what's overserved, we're going to look at what table stake needs are, so that we can put a complete picture together of where we need to go innovate. And when we think about segments, we're not going to talk about demographics or psychographics. We're going to discover groups of people that struggle in unique ways to get the job done. Now, all this goes into a model. And what we're doing here is very basic. We're discovering who the customer is you're trying to create value for, what is the job they're trying to get done, what are their needs, which are underserved and overserved, and are there segments of people with different unmet needs? Again, basic marketing 101, but a process for getting there. Once we have all this information, we can build out a data model that can be used for a whole variety of purposes. So I'll share some of them with you. But think about this as a data model, right? We're building a model. It's going to have all these metrics in it that people can use to evaluate different concepts to see which one gets the job done best and along what dimensions. With this insight, we can help companies better position the products they already have, often increasing revenue just based on repositioning. We can help them with the product life cycle or the customer experience elements. We can help them with getting the job done better by product improvements, informing M&A decisions, informing digital strategies, and so on. A whole variety of purposes. So let me go into detail on each one here. We're going to start with defining the market. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to define a market as a group of people and the job they're trying to get done, not a product. Products are ever changing, right? We're looking for something that's stable over time. And the job itself is stable over time. The way we think about a job to be done, it's anything that the customer is trying to accomplish. It could be a goal, it could be a task, it could be whatever the customer is trying to do. If there's a product that could be designed for it, we focus on that task, activity, goal, objective, and we call it a job. That's the job the customer is trying to get done. We think about it like this: group of people and the job. It could be music enthusiasts trying to listen to music. It could be business professionals trying to create a digital asset. It could be parents trying to pass on life lessons to children. Now you see the pattern here? In each case, it's a group of people, parents, so on, and the underlying job they try to execute. It's always stated as a process. It has a specific format as well. It could be tradesmen trying to cut a piece of wood in a straight line. It could be legal teams who are trying to discover information that can support or refute a legal case. And we could go on forever, right? Every one of you works in markets where people are buying products to get a job done. Now, once we define the job in this way, we can just start covering customer needs. It's not always easy to define the job. You could go out to customers, for example, and be the kettle maker in this example, and the kettle maker could go to customers and say, why use my product? And they might say, well, I'm using it to boil water, which is true, and you could go back and make the best water boiling device, but you're missing out on the bigger picture, right? What they're really doing is using that boiled water as an input to get a bigger job done, which is to prepare a hot beverage for consumption. When we think about the next step, it's defining the customer's needs. We know what the job is. Now we're going to start breaking that down. And I like thinking about this in a hierarchy, where we have the core job up on top, we have steps that the customer's trying to get done, and then we have the outcomes. And notice how we refer to this. It's what they're trying to do. So you could go out and do observational research and watch what the customer is doing, but what they're doing is tied to solutions. So we're not studying what they're doing, we're studying what they're trying to do. So this can't be done just through observation. We need to talk to customers to figure out what it is they're trying to accomplish as they're doing the things they're doing. We accomplish this by first creating what we call the job map. This is not a process map, it's not a customer journey map, it's breaking down the job and what they're trying to accomplish. And in every situation, customers are trying to get the entire job done, preferably on a single platform. They don't want to have to cobble together solutions to get pieces of the job done. So you can read a bit more about this in the HBR piece that we put together that describes all the steps. But at a high level, this affords us a number of advantages. One is we know what the customer is trying to accomplish, so we can accelerate the pace at which we can help them get the job done. So for example, in the music, you see MP3s come along, they get more of the job done better, and the product gets adopted for use. You see streaming services come along, gets more of the job done better, it gets adopted for use. All right? This happens in every market. Products evolve to get the entire job done on a single platform. If you know what the entire job is, you can get your company there faster than anybody else. And that's really one of the advantages to creating the job map. The next step in this is to figure out the outcomes, right? Again, the hierarchy. This is where we've spent a lot of time over the years to figure out what is the perfect needs statement, right? And we feel like we've invented the perfect needs statement. And it starts by looking at this from scratch. We say, what does this have to inform? Well, first off, it has to be a constant in the equation, which is why we tie it to the job to be done, right? And it also has to be something that the customer uses to measure success when getting the job done. On top of that, this same piece of information has to be useful to developers and has to be measurable and controllable in the design of the product. And it's really an unfortunate situation where the customer needs have to be stated in words. And those words have to have meaning to both the customer and the company. They can't be ambiguous, they have to meet a set of rules. They have to be solution agnostic. They have to be predictive in nature. And they have to be cross-functionally applicable. And this is one of the big benefits of the approach. In many cases, we work with clients where nobody agrees on what all the needs are, But at the end of a day, in a workshop, we can get everybody to agree on what all the customer's needs are. And you can imagine how transformational that is to a company, going from a point where nobody agrees on what a need is to everyone agrees on what the needs are. We've learned a lot along the way here. We define these needs in a very specific fashion. You see they have a format, a structure to them. We've tested this in so many different surveys over the years. And outcome statements, or needs in general, are highly sensitive statements. Just the way you introduce the word, minimize versus decrease or reduce or prevent or eliminate, the way you start these sentences and the way they're structured can actually impact the way they're rated by customers for importance and satisfaction, which is why we take great care in making sure we don't introduce variability into the process simply by the way we define an outcome statement. So again, we've worked hard on this to figure out the best construct, and they look like this. We've also learned that customers don't have 5 or 6 needs. They have many needs, often 100 or more for a given job. So when we do our qualitative work, we work through the job map to figure out how do people measure success along each step of the way. All right? Through this qualitative effort, we build what we call the qualitative data model. And here we have all our list of metrics that people are using to judge the value of our PC Junior product, in that case. And we can start looking at different solutions to see the strengths and weaknesses of those different solutions as those products have emerged over time. This next chart here really, I think, explains a lot. This goes into the needs framework. But what we've discovered is that, of course, customers are trying to get this core job done, but there's other metrics that they use to decide which product's going to win in the marketplace. One is what we call related jobs. You know, while a customer's trying to get one job done, they may be trying to get multiple jobs done. And if you can create a platform-level solution that gets lots of jobs done, that product is worth more than one that gets just one job done. It can actually eliminate the need to buy other products. I like using this little device here as an example. You know, years ago, this simply was a pointer, right? But presenters have other jobs they're trying to get done while they're presenting. They're trying to advance their slides, they're trying to time their presentations, and so on. So these little devices have evolved to get more and more jobs done on a single platform, making them more relevant and valuable. We also know that customers have what we call emotional jobs. They want to be perceived a certain way by their peers. They want to feel a certain way as a result of getting their job done. And knowing what these emotional jobs are helps us better position the products in the marketplace. The next piece is absolutely critical. We call these consumption chain jobs. People have to buy the product, receive it, install it, set it up, learn how to use it. They have to interface with it, upgrade it. Now, people aren't buying products so they can receive them, install them, and upgrade them, right? They're buying products to get that core job done. But you have to be proficient at the consumption jobs as well in order to win in the marketplace. So knowing where products are deficient there is absolutely critical as well. And then the final piece are the financial metrics that the buyer uses to decide if they want product A or product B. In a lot of cases, the buyer is not the user, right? So this adds some complexity to the situation. But knowing that, we can get the set of financial metrics that the buyer's using, prioritize those separately with the buyer, and take all the other inputs and have them prioritized by the job executor. So far, so good. Let's go on to the third step, which is now we want to figure out, of all these needs, which ones are overserved and ripe for value creation, which ones are underserved, I said it the wrong way, which ones are underserved and ripe for value creation, and which are overserved and ripe for cost reduction. So with this, we rely on quantitative research. And again, this has evolved quite dramatically over time as well. Our surveys are pretty complex. They often have well over 120, 30 questions in them. It takes customers about 30 minutes or so to get through them and prioritize them. And we pay people to do this. And we also know that in any given situation, 5 to 15% of the people may dishonestly fill out the survey, and they have to be filtered out in real time in order to make sure we're getting valid data. But all those bugs are worked out. The key here is that we want to figure out which of these outcomes are really important and which are poorly satisfied. What we do with this data is we plot it on what we call the opportunity landscape. Right? Here we see the importance on horizontal, satisfaction, vertical scale. That one dot there represents one outcome statement. Right? So of all the 100+ needs, that's one outcome prioritized by, let's say, 300 different respondents. And that gets plotted there because 81% of those 300 people said it's very or extremely important outcome, yet only 30% say it's very or extremely satisfied. Right? So now what we're going to do here is prioritize all these. We give them a score and a priority. We want to figure out which needs are most underserved and most overserved. And we can lay them all out here on this graphic. They often look like this. So on the far right, we see these needs that are underserved. And this is where people are often willing to pay more to get the job done better. Then we see over here where the market is overserved. Again, if you think about innovation as getting the job done better and or more cheaply, this is where you focus to get the job done more cheaply. We also look up here. We call these table stakes. These are outcomes that are very important, but they're very satisfied as well. And if you're going to create a new product, it has to address these table stake outcomes. Okay, so these are the inputs we're going to use as we go into this fourth step, which is absolutely critical. We've never created a strategy around the total market. In other words, people don't agree on what needs are important and unsatisfied. There's always variation. Every market has different groups of people that think different needs are unmet. So to discover them, we don't segment around gender, we don't segment around age, or any demographic or psychographic classification scheme. What we're going to do is to segment around the unmet needs. This is literally segments of customers with different unmet needs. Now, you can't do this if you don't agree on what a need is, or what the needs are, or which are unmet. But once you have this information, you can perform this analysis, which reveals the kind of segments that you need to focus on in order to create value for customers. So in a given market, you may have 300 people taking the survey. A third of those people might think outcomes 10, 20, and 30 are really important and unsatisfied. Another third might think outcomes 40, 50, and 60 are really important and unsatisfied, and so on. So what we do to figure this out is we run a factor analysis and then a cluster analysis, statistical tools that have been around forever, and we plot out those different segments. We put the different groups of people in different segments, and then we discover, by profiling them, is to figure out who's in these segments and why did they cluster the way they did. What unique circumstance led them to be underserved, right? In that sense, we put a persona together, a persona that's based on the data behind this analysis. On average, a market could look like this, and we see this all the time. This is before segmentation. You get 300 people, it looks like on average there's no opportunities. And if you think like this, you'd walk away saying, we're in a commodity market. We can't compete on getting the job done better. We're going to have to compete on price. But after segmentation, a market may look like this. The reality is, on average, nobody's underserved or overserved, but there is a highly underserved segment and a highly overserved segment. And there's a segment in the middle that has some unmet needs as well. This comes from a market that we worked with dentists performing a tooth restoration or filling. And on the far left, you see that the market looks very well satisfied. Well, in this case, they were working on patients that had healthy gums and required a very small filling. In that situation, the products they use today were working just fine. But on the far right, they were working on patients that had unhealthy gums and required a large filling. And in that situation, they're very underserved. You can envision, as if people have unhealthy gums, when they're, the visualization becomes much more difficult because they tend to bleed a bit more. It makes it harder to contour the shape and keep the area dry. So in that condition or in that set of circumstances, people really struggle to get the job done. Now this has lots of ramifications, especially on strategy, because you're not going to have just one strategy for this market. There's not one thing you're going to go do. There's three things that you need to do to win over the entire market. The first is you could perform or execute a sustaining strategy on that middle segment. And you see they have 5 or 10 unmet needs or so. You could take your current products, focus on those 10 unmet needs and get the job done better. At the same time, go after this 19% red segment with a cost-reduced product. Take your current product, cost-reduce them along those different dimensions, and compete on price in that segment. And then invest in this other platform here that will get the job done better in this most difficult circumstance. Now, we see this more often than not. All these are examples of real studies that we've done over the years, some in the software space, some in the service space, hardware space. We never know how it's going to turn out. And this is why every market deserves its own unique strategy. This comes from an all-terrain vehicle manufacturer who didn't even know that that red segment existed. They had 50% market share in the other two segments and just 5% in that segment. It became a $150 million opportunity for them. The first realization, it was just recognizing that the segment existed. And this is one of my favorites here, discovering hidden segments of opportunity in the circular saw market. This is working with Bosch Corporation. This was interesting because Bosch was trying to enter the North American circular saw market. They knew they were going to make a circular saw. They wanted to compete with Lowe's, with Makita and DeWalt, and have their saw in places like Lowe's and Home Depot. And the goal was to come up with a product that got the job better, but at the same price point. Okay? Now what they did is they went through this process. They discovered one segment of customers that had a unique set of unmet needs. And it's this segment over here. This became their target. In order for them to get the job done better at the same price point, that meant that they had to go after that segment, satisfy those 14 unmet needs, and do so without adding any price to the circular saw, which is exactly what they did. And this is really the beauty of the approach. What we're trying to accomplish here is to bring predictability to the innovation process. And as you can see here, they were able to narrow down to a very specific segment and a very specific set of needs that they could focus on to win in the marketplace. They're trying to stack the odds in their favor, right? If you think about it like this, what are the chances that the Bosch team would have randomly come up with a solution that addressed those 14 unmet needs in that segment if they didn't know the segment existed and they didn't know that those are the 14 unmet needs? Slim to none. How long do you think it took them to come up with a solution that addressed those 14 unmet needs once they knew that segment existed and they knew those are the 14 unmet needs? It took them about 3 hours. And as they said, well, it's not as if we didn't have these ideas before. The problem is we've had thousands of ideas before. They had like a 10,000 idea database that they routinely used. And once they identified the problem at this level of granularity, they were able to solve it pretty quickly and released the CS20 circular saw, which became very popular for a good period of time. About 10 years, it became their best-selling circular saw in the North American market. What I also want to do is tell a story of Kroll On-Track. This is more in the service and software space. This goes back to the early 2000s. Ben Allen, who's the CEO of On-Track at the time, came to us after they failed twice to enter the electronic evidence discovery market. And let me just give you a little background on that as well. On-Track made they had a technique for removing or extracting, I should say, information from damaged hard drives. So if you ever damage a hard drive back in that time frame, you send it off to them, they'll get the data and protect it for you. So they thought, well, we're really good at extracting data off hard drives. So when it comes to these legal battles, if IBM's in a situation where they are in a legal case, they have to go get all this information off all these hard drives that exist all around the company. And they felt that they could do that pretty effectively. So the first couple times out, they did that. They went to the IT departments in those companies, And they showed them how they could extract all this data off the hard drives. Well, they failed twice. And then Ben Allen came to us and said, what are we doing wrong? Well, the very first thing we looked at is, who's the job executor? Well, it turns out it wasn't the IT department. The job executor was actually the legal teams. And the job they were trying to get done is to capture data that would support or refute their case. So what this meant is they had to go get information and be able to search it and find information in there that would be valuable to support their case. So think about this from a minimal viable product standpoint, for example. If you're trying to come up with a product that's going to win in the marketplace, minimal viable product may have to address certain steps in the job map in a very elegant way before they could even win. And that's what they learned. The third time around, they not only extracted data from the hard drive, but they added search capabilities that the legal team could use to extract this information, go through it, and see if they could find information that would refute or support their case. Well, this became a hit. And it was very hard catching Kroll Ontrack because they had this list of 100 or so outcomes. The minimal viable product addressed about 40 of them. And then year after year, they would address 5 or 10 more outcomes and just get the job done better and better over time each year. And they had this master vision. They knew what the entire job was. They knew the outcomes they had to achieve and the priority order they had to achieve them. And with all that insight, they became impossible to catch for about 15 years or so. And this is really the beauty of the approach. And the last step here, we talk about building out this data model. The data model can be used, like I said, for a whole variety of purposes. Going back to the Kroll Ontrack story, they used it for nearly every one of these purposes over a period of 10 years. It was 10 years later that their new president called us up and said, we've used this data for a long time. It might be time that we refresh it. And during that time, we got great insight into how they had been using the data. And it was for all these different purposes. One is for marketing. How do we position our product vis-a-vis our competitors so we can gain a competitive advantage? What are their weaknesses? Remember, they had this whole list of things that were priorities. They could tell that when a competitor came in with a new feature, that was actually low on the list, or if it was high on the list, and then they could make adjustments in how they were developing their product. A very effective approach. From a customer experience standpoint, they use the approach to figure out the best ways to help customers set up the product, learn how to use it, install it, interface with it, and so on. From a product portfolio management standpoint, they realized that there were parts of the job that they couldn't get done on their own. And they actually had to reach out and build a new M&A strategy that would allow them to gather the capabilities and inputs they needed to get the entire job done on a single platform, which is what they did as well. So think of it like this. They had this roadmap with the job map with all the outcomes, and they systematically decided what they should build, what they should buy, the order in which they should do this in order to be the most effective in the marketplace. And as UX UI designers, you're in the same boat. This is what we need to figure out how to do. Getting it done is extremely difficult. I wanted to just talk briefly about, are you developing a PC Junior? Right? And this will leave a little food for thought. This space is very interesting. Now, I'll tell a story here that takes me back to the 1980s again, and I see the exact same thing playing out here. In the 1980s, when I was at IBM, we would say that the marketing team never gave us good inputs to build our product. And as engineers, we would have to go out to customers to figure out what they want, right? Now, from the way I think about it today is the marketing team did a poor job at giving us all the inputs we needed, all the customer needs, and define the product at the level that's necessary in order to win. So what the engineers did is they created a new movement called the voice of the customer. This comes from the engineering side of the house. This is not the market research side of the house. Engineers went out and said, we have to go figure out these inputs. Marketing's not giving us the information we need in order to win. So they started developing these techniques that would help them understand what customers want. Now, what I see happening today is the exact same thing in the UX UI world. You have product planners up front that's supposed to be telling you what that core job is and what all the outcomes are and where you should focus and segment by segment. But in many cases, they're not. So they put a vague concept over the fence to the development team, and you're left to figure all this stuff out. What this does is it's forcing UX and UI people to become product planners and product strategists. And many of you may feel that pressure. You may not be trained to do that, but you're in that role because the marketing team or the product planning team is not, I'll say, doing their job. And it's not because they're not doing the job because they're bad people, it's that they just don't know how to execute the process correctly to get you the information that you need. So I think the big movement here in the UX UI world is to sort all this out. Who should do what? Should the UX UI team be doing all of this and capturing outcomes on the core job, the consumption jobs, and everything else? And should you lead the charge? It's up to you, right? You can lead the charge. I think backing an approach like this will help you get there faster and more effectively. So that's what we'd recommend so that you're not working on a failed product. And I know we have a little extra time here, but I'm ready for questions from our team already if they're up for it. David,
Let's give you an applause first. Yeah. Come on.
Thanks, David.
Hi. Nice.
Now, David, earlier you said you had some great questions for me.
I've got some fantastic
We
questions.
have questions for you,
Oh,
of course.
gosh.
Both of us, actually.
Oh, great. Okay.
Well, I'm just curious. Could you tell us something
What are
about
these
these
about?
posters?
Sure. These are my little buddies, and I bring them everywhere I go because
Do you keep them in your luggage? Like, how do you board the flights?
very carefully. No, we obviously have them made here, but I like to show the highlight here that this is a process. There's a needs framework. There's steps. I know you can't even probably see these diagrams from the audience, but it denotes that this is a process. And what we're trying to emphasize here is innovation is a process. It's measurable, it's controllable, it's predictable if you follow a formula. And we spent a lot of years trying to figure out how not to fail, basically. And this is just representative of that kind of thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing I'm curious about, you describe the jobs to be done and the needs and ways of grouping those. Does your framework have anything to say when it comes to solving them? Like the Bosch team, they found the needs that they were supposed to address, and then 3 hours they were done. But is there anything else in the framework that helps us to go from these needs and jobs to solutions?
There is. Now, interestingly enough, most companies know how to solve the problem once they know the problem. So it's actually pretty rare that we need to help them through that exercise. But on occasion, we'll do the ideation type style work where we present the top 14 unmet needs like we did at Bosch, and we just take them through the exercise because they may come up with 3 different ideas to address a certain need. So we want to help them figure out, well, which one's going to get the job done best? Which one addresses the metric? And so we have a good engineering discussion, minimize the time it takes to do X. Well, it takes 3 minutes now. Did it reduce it down to 2 minutes or 1 minute? Well, how do we get it down to 0 minutes? How do you automate that particular outcome so satisfaction level is optimal? So that's one way. We've also developed a series of creativity triggers over the years. Going back to, if you're familiar with trees and Scamper and things like that, they're all creativity triggers. But they were designed, I think, to really work in the mechanical product or electromechanical situation. So we spent about 6 months, this was maybe 6-7 years ago, looking at all these creativity triggers and elevating the concepts up to the point, abstracting them so they'd be useful in anything, whether it's software creation, design, service, hardware, and so on. So
where do we find those?
They are on our website, I want to say. I don't know. I'll find out. Yeah. And they're very effective in the sense that it gives you different pathways in which you could win over on the solution. It could be done through information, the power source, the way you configure the system, the geometrical structure. It's a very interesting way, all-encompassing, and it utilizes all those different creativity triggers in a very useful way.
I also have a follow-up question. So if that's what's happening after we've identified the jobs and the needs, I was unsure how you did, when you did the questionnaire,
Yep.
where do those questions come from? Is it interviews that are used, like qualitative research that's used to base the questionnaire on? Or?
Yeah, exactly. So it starts with qualitative work. That's step 2, where we're right here, where we're uncovering the customer's unmet needs, or the customer's needs. So it's the huge list. We'll typically do anywhere from 5 to 30 interviews, depending on how complicated the situation is, to work out the complete set of outcome statements. That's part of it. So we have everything you saw up there. We have the outcomes on the core job, outcomes on the consumption job, related jobs, emotional jobs, a lot of information. But on top of that, we have to add some demographic questions so we can tie it back to their traditional segments. We have to have what we call complexity factor questions in there. And these are the things that you are guessing at to see what's causing the segments to be underserved. So I gave that dental example, right, where we said, well, it turns out that patients with unhealthy gums in a large filling are causing that segment to be underserved. Now, we didn't know that going in, right? So we asked dentists, in what situations is it harder to get the job done? And they said, well, you know, when the cavity is way back in the mouth, or if it's behind the tooth, or if your gums are unhealthy. And they gave us 20 reasons why it could be harder. So we put all those in the survey too, and it turns out that only 2 explain the causality. Right? That segment's underserved because of that situation. And that's highly valuable. And it took us a long time to evolve to that because we're basically guessing at what the causation is in advance of putting the survey together. So all that goes in the survey, and that goes out to the 300 people that we pay, good money often, to fill it out in an honest way so we have good statistically valid data.
Thank you
Yeah,
for filling
pleasure.
that out.
So, Tony, you've worked with many of the Fortune 100 companies, and our boss, Johan, he wanted us to ask, what's the key to be able to work with say, one of these at sea level? Do you have any tips and tricks for him? He's sitting over here.
Hi. You're looking for helpful information, I see. Well, you know, from a sea-level standpoint, think of it as a measurement system. Like if you had that kind of data, all those metrics that's sitting there, when people come in and say, hey, we want to fund this project, or we want to invest in this R&D activity, or we want to buy this company, make sure they've gone through and done their homework, and they can come to you and say, we're doing this because it's going to help us get this part of the job done better, and it's going to address these 5 unmet needs that we can't address on our own. Right? So if you can hold them accountable to getting the job done better and use that as a guiding map, that's probably the most useful thing you could do as a C-level person. The other part is to make sure that there is agreement on what customer needs are. Right? If nothing else, going from a point where people don't agree on the needs to they agree on all the needs, even if you don't do any of the quantification, none of the segmentation, nothing else, at least you'd be on the right path. You know, you're heading down the right channel. You're in the right ballpark. So making sure they do that work and there's common agreement across all those needs is really critical. Is that helpful?
Are you happy with that, Johan? Okay, so you'll probably
more.
continue the dialogue afterwards.
Great.
Or do you have a follow-up question? Yeah. Come up.
Johan Benson.
Or stand very close to me.
A mic for Johan?
You can stand very close to me and speak
No,
into my mic.
it's soon. They're coming out
No, it doesn't work.
from backstage here.
Or ask your question and Tony will hear it.
Okay, so my question is basically...
Here it comes, Johan. Thank you.
Hi. So my question is basically, in this community, I and many other people have sort of struggled to get the C-level to recognize the qualitative methods and the way we are working and thinking. And sometimes they listen, but most times they don't. So I'm a bit envious because I really think that we do this better than you do. But they are listening to you. And that bothers me. So that's sort of the question that I want to solve before you can leave.
Well, so you're going through this process, right? You're going through a process.
Well, I think we have a better process, but we can talk about that later. So, to me, it's about legitimacy in these kind of situations. And I think we have a hard time to be legitimate, to sort of get access and to be believable in these situations. But you seem to do a very good job at that. So, how do you do that?
Well, practice?
I've been practicing for 20 years.
Well, you know, I think one of the key things that we've done is we've executed this process 1,000 times, over 1,000 times. And we've worked with a lot of great companies doing it as well. So we've got to see it apply in manufacturing environments and software environments, services, and so on. And at a high level, everyone's trying to do the same thing. They're trying to create products that address unmet customer needs. There's nuances in every case, but the fundamentals remain the same. And discovering what those fundamentals are was really the key. And I think it's really hard to see what those fundamentals are unless you've just covered and spanned all those different industries and see what really does work and what resonates. In some industries, like for example, the consumption chain elements are irrelevant. In some situations, the emotional jobs are irrelevant. But in total, all these pieces are relevant. Some are more or less so given a given circumstance. And so knowing what the pieces are and then knowing how they're going to work in a given situation, I think that's really the key. Yeah.
Yeah, better. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Johan.
And we have a gift for you, Tony.
Here's a gift for
We're out
Tony.
of questions? Okay, great.
And
Thank you
it's
so much.
a book about Sweden and also a diploma because you have just paid for 100 girls learning how to read worldwide. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.